Hello, and welcome to Hannibal and Friends, the YouTube channel about a cat who hates Mondays and loves true crime lasagna. That's my story, I'm sticking to it. It is all this guy's fault. This is my pandemic kitten, Hannibal. So it's a little unfortunate. Hannibal is not actually at this first filming with us. He had to be out of town. He's visiting his sister, Starling. And yes, obviously I named them after Hannibal Lecter and Clarice Starling because you'll come to find it's really fitting for me and my family. But I'm sure that if this continues past a few episodes, Hannibal will definitely be here for some recordings, and I'm sure we can get a guest appearance from Starling. Also, if this does actually get viewed by anybody, I would love to see more serial killer inspired pets. Here are a few pics of mine. He's a drama queen. Yeah. Hannibal and Friends is in fact another true crime YouTube channel. What I'm going to do is use fictional characters from television shows and movies in order to inspire my true crime selections. This will focus on fictional killers inspired by real life criminals, but it will also include biopics, maybe a few documentary reviews, and definitely white and red collar criminals as well. All criminals are welcome to a Hannibal and Friends party. Now, I do want to put out there that while I am fascinated by some of these fictional killers, and I find true crime very interesting on a variety of levels, I do want to emphasize that I don't intend to glamorize any of the killings or the killers or belittle or ignore the victims. When we remove the screen, they become real people with real families and real tragedies that are occurring. So these are more about examining how we look at criminality and horror and death on film, how we relate to and interact with true crime, and also it's just another platform to get stories out there, whether that is a way for you to pick up on a safety tip, whether to maybe re-spark an interest in a case, or just get some facts out there. So I just want to put that out there as kind of a disclaimer. For our inaugural episode, we are of course starting with the inspiration of this channel, Hannibal Lecter, Dr. Hannibal Lecter. Now, Hannibal Lecter is an iconic figure in cinematic criminality. He is probably best known for his portrayal by Sir Anthony Hopkins in the 1991 Jonathan Demme film, Silence of the Lambs. Now, this man is iconic. With only 16 minutes on screen, not only did Anthony Hopkins win Best Supporting Actor, but Hannibal Lecter has held the position of AFI's #1 greatest villain of all time since 2003. Now, granted, they haven't held that competition again, but since 2003, I mean, no one's unseated him. It's great.
A census taker once tried to test me. I ate his liver with some fava beans and a nice Chianti.
Who can hear Chianti now and not think cannibalism and fava beans? Do Chianti and fava beans actually go together? I assume he's wrong about the cannibalism part, but fava beans and Chianti are not really my go-to pairing either, so what do I know? Despite the monumental impact that Hopkins' Dr. Lecter had on our pop culture, he is not in fact the actor that originated the role. That honor goes to Brian Cox. In 1986, Michael Mann's Manhunter is actually the cinematic premiere for our psychotic psychiatrist. Based on Thomas Harris's best-selling novel, Red Dragon, that came out in 1981, Manhunter follows the story of Will Graham and his psychotic delusions basically as he tries to come out of retirement and capture Francis Dolarhyde, the Red Dragon. Dr. Lecter actually only comes into this film partway through. That seems to be a running theme on how we use Dr. Lecter in these movies, perhaps for a reason. And for all that Hopkins has really claimed the mantle of Dr. Lecter since, Manhunter actually has received rave reviews. It holds a 93% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, so people like that original Lecter as well. And we also can't downplay the impact that Thomas Harris's original novel had on the serial killer subgenre. It really launched our interest and fascination in the genre and in Hannibal Lecter himself. Anthony Hopkins takes over in the 1991 Silence of the Lambs adaptation. Now, what I find really fascinating is that Red Dragon, Manhunter, Silence of the Lambs, they all deal with post-convicted Hannibal Lecter. So we're not dealing with his crimes themselves, and he's actually not the main quote-unquote villain of any of these films, which I think adds to the fascination that we hold with him. In many ways, the villains we only receive glimpses of and remain shrouded in mystery and darkness are the ones we find the most compelling. When we shine a light on them, they often are revealed to be pathetic. Hopkins did reprise his iconic role again in both Hannibal and in Red Dragon. However, neither really quite capture that same initial spark that we had with this mysterious doctor. Though Red Dragon does fare a bit better, it has like a 68% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, and I personally have a bit of a soft spot for it. I kind of love Ed Norton, who plays Will Graham in this version. We have Philip Seymour Hoffman as Freddie Loudis, Harvey Keitel as Jack Crawford, and Ray Fiennes as Francis Dolarhyde / Red Dragon. So talk about a star-studded cast. I mean, come on. It is a little bit clunky at times and has been accused of not really being all that original, which is fair enough, but not a terrible watch. At least not as terrible as the reactions that 2007's Hannibal Rising gets. Now, this is a film that attempts to explore the background of our dear doctor, and it does not go over well. No. Anthony Hopkins himself doesn't even return for this film, so not great, unfortunately. That being said, one of the few prequels that actually works for me is also one of my favorite television series ever, Hannibal. This was created by Brian Fuller and stars Mads Mikkelsen as our devious doctor. And yes, I'm going to find a bunch of different alliterations to use for him because it's fun. So I am, on a side note, not a fan of prequels just overall. I really don't like dramatic irony. I don't like knowing what's going to happen to that character's life at the end. It just doesn't appeal to me. That being said, Hannibal the series is incredible. I adored it. This time, we find Hannibal as a younger, pre-incarcerated psychiatrist who is brought on to assist in some criminal cases as well as help, big emphasis, grain of salt on that, help Will Graham, who is slowly but surely deteriorating. That's the word. And he is played masterfully by Mads Mikkelsen, as I mentioned. And now a fun side note about this picture. So it makes me think of this scene that they have in Hannibal where they're at a dinner party and it's a very ornately decorated long table. And I remember watching an interview with Mads Mikkelsen where he's talking about the battle of wills he got into with the set designer because he kept removing in between takes these skulls and I guess like bone decorations that were surrounding his plate because he was just like, I'm evil. I am obviously evil. Everybody knows I'm evil. We do not need the skull and crossbones decorating my plate to point this out. We are a little bit hitting this on the head. People know I'm evil. So I just found that hysterical. It unironically killed me. Anyway, back on track. We have a Danish actor playing our Lithuanian doctor and Hugh Dacey playing Will Graham. As I mentioned, detective who is losing his mind. It is interesting. This series is beautiful, almost disturbingly beautiful, how they make the artistry of the murders, to the point where it inspired a lot of cultural as well as academic papers and discussions on the balance between art and gratuitous gore, amongst other topics. This really brought out a lot of contention and controversy for people. It also is the show that launched 1,000 memes of every time Will and Lecter look at each other. There is chemistry for days between those two. It is fire. And in 2019, Rolling Stone honored Mikkelsen's Hannibal as being the 18th greatest villain in television history. So there we go. Mads Mikkelsen gets a nice little nod on a list as well. Ignoring Hannibal Rising for a moment, it seems that with each iteration of Hannibal Lecter, each actor takes him on in a new and compelling way that adds depth, interest, and popularity to the character for their respective generations. So I think that's fascinating that this character, this doctor, has held our attention for so long, especially when only really in that television series was he ever a main character and his murders actually explored. So I think that really speaks to the impact that our good Dr. Lecter had on our pop culture society and our serial killer subgenre. So who inspired this detestable doctor? Well, the answer to that had actually been a mystery for many years. Many famous names or infamous names were thrown about, including Jeffrey Dahmer, as well as Albert Fish. A group of homicide detectives who were actually personally familiar with the author suggested in a 1999 Tulsa World feature that Lecter was actually a composite of Ted Bundy and M. Kemper for their intelligence and Isaiah Sagawa for the cannibal in the mixture. And Harris was more than happy to let his readers duke it out. Until 2013, he kept silent on the matter. Then, for the 25th anniversary of the publication of Silence of the Lamb, he wrote an additional introduction, and in it, he revealed a hint towards who his mysterious inspiration was. Harris reveals that Dr. Lecter was not actually purely from his own imagination, but was in fact inspired by the Mexican surgeon, Alfredo Balli Treviño, who was convicted of murdering and then chopping up his lover. Now, how did Harris discover Treviño? Well, it was actually for an article on a different inmate. Little 23-year-old Thomas Harris was sent in the 1960s to Topo Chico Penitentiary in Nuevo León, Mexico, for a story for Argosy, which is an American pulp fiction magazine. Now, this story was actually on a different inmate. Harris was there to do a story on Dykes Askew Simmons, an American convict who, long story short, was convicted of a triple murder, attempted to escape by bribing a guard, and was then double-crossed by said guard. The guard was supposed to open the door for Simmons and provide him with a pistol, but in a surprise twist of awful human being awful to another human, the guard, in fact, locked Simmons in and shot him. But Simmons didn't die because his life was actually saved by fellow inmate Treviño. I would actually like more information on this part of the story. We'll get to it later, but Treviño does have allowances that let him practice medicine on some inmates and other people. But is there no prison doctor? Do they just bring him in for every major surgery? I don't know. I mean, knowing that Treviño worked there, I guess makes it a little bit more sense, but it still seems like a lot of free range for a convicted murderer. Now, back to Harris on his visit to the prison for a story on this double-crossed American triple murderer. So Harris thought it'd be interesting to interview the doctor who saved this man's life. Things get a little twisted, it's noted, when the doctor, who Harris calls Dr. Salazar in his article, starts to bring up Simmons' disfiguration, the attractiveness of his victims, and the nature of torture. Here's an exchange that is reported to have between the journalist and the doctor. Dr. Salazar said, "Do you think Simmons was tormented on the school playground? What, because he was disfigured?" When Harris said he probably was, the doctor asked whether Simmons' victims were attractive. After Harris said they were and asked if he was suggesting that this provoked Simmons, Dr. Salazar responded, "Certainly not. But early torment makes torment easily imagined." And yes, there was an ellipsis between easily and imagined in that quote. He went on to ask, "You are a journalist, Mr. Harris. How would you put that in your journal? How would you treat the fear of torment in journalese? Might you say something snappy about torment, like it puts the hell in hello?" No, turns out this was all suspicious for a reason. It was only after Harris left the prison that he learns that it was not the prison doctor he was speaking to, but in fact a convicted murderer. Afterwards, a prison guard or the warden, different reports call him different things, but he says to Harris, "Hombre, he will never leave this place. He is insane." A ringing endorsement, if I have ever heard one, for a doctor. Of course, this was not an accurate prediction because after 20 years, Treviño's sentence was commuted and he was released in 2000. So I guess he did get out of there. He continued to practice medicine until he died in 2009 as well, which in and of itself is horrifying. Imagine being in a position with your healthcare that your choice that you go to is a convicted murderer because you can't get another option. So how did this prisoner end up in prison? Biography.com references the UK Times article and the Latin Times in their profiles of Alfredo Treviño for a lot of their source material. He was born on October 2nd of 1931, the second of 5 children. He was born into a prominent family in Mendez, Tamaulipas, and he had a rather strict father who often pushed him and his siblings to excel in their studies, which, since he also had 2 brothers who also were in med school, that does seem to have worked to a certain extent. He was said to have a lot in common with his father, including that strict character, and also apparently a predilection for carrying around a gun. Side note, the Latin Times article says, and I quote, "Although he wasn't allowed a weapon in prison, Alfredo's attitude and the nature of his crime that brought him to jail helped him win the respect of other inmates." Like, is it just me, or should that not be a given? Like, of course he doesn't have a weapon. Why would he have a weapon in prison? Anyway, Treviño certainly seems to have excelled, at least for a while. However, that career did not happen, at least not in the way that the father or son had probably initially imagined. On October 9th, 1959, Treviño and his lover, Jesus Castillo Rengal, got into a deadly fight. Treviño and Rengal were apparently high school sweethearts, and Rengal had gone on to work for Treviño as well. Now, what this fight was actually about is unknown. There are several different conflicting reports. Some say Rengal wouldn't loan a desperate Treviño cash. Some say Rengal wanted to end the relationship. There are also other stories that say it was Rengal who wasn't paying Treviño back for a loan, and that Treviño really insisted on that he needed to marry a woman. So there are just too many stories out here that contradict and conflict with each other, and unfortunately the only people who know the truth are Treviño and Rengal is not here to tell us his side of the story. Whatever caused the fight, the end result was horrific. Treviño knocks out Rengal. Many reports say it was drugging, though some don't specify. Some articles I've read say the police report claims that Treviño first used an anesthetic and then injected Rengal with a second additional drug and brought Rengal into the bathtub and slit his throat with a scalpel. After slicing his throat, he let the body drain of the blood and chopped him up into tiny enough pieces that the warden called it a surprisingly small box that he was able to fit the body in. He then tried to bury the box on a relative's ranch. He even recruited the help of a ranch hand to help him bury it. He claimed that he was burying medical waste, which is why he was able to get this accomplice's help. The smallness, as I said again, the surprisingly small nature of the box, I think is part of what lends the macabre nature to this quest. The fact that he was able to use his scalpel and whatever other tools he had to so thoroughly get rid of the body. But I think that's where we start pulling in our Hannibal Lecter vibes. There is a somewhat charismatic mystique that is put over this doctor, in large part due to the fascination we have with his fictional prodigy, admittedly. But Harris himself describes him as a small, lithe man with dark red hair who had a certain elegance about him. And apparently he was known for his fashion sense, which included a light-colored suit, dark sunglasses, and a gold Rolex, which I didn't realize you could have choices like that in prison, but I don't actually know that much about prison wear, so maybe. Also, apparently he kept this gold Rolex for like a very long time and then accidentally threw out a sock where he had held it and said, "I went through hell, but I lost a sock." Like, that's also just bizarre to me. As someone who once threw out my credit cards in a tissue packet, I suppose I can't really judge, but it's a Rolex watch, come on. Anyway, whatever we think about his fashion choices, we do really need to remember that this man is a murderer. And there's not really any reports I read that suggest that Rengal really was that aggressive in the fight or did something that made it seem more like a self-defense situation. There is one report that suggests that Rangel started the physical attack and slashed at Treviño with a screwdriver, though that was only in one report. Plus, Rangel in multiple reports is said to have been drugged by Treviño. So clearly at some point there was a stopping point where it didn't have to go to a murder. And honestly, there is nothing elegant about this kind of brutality that was inflicted upon this man. So Harris, I might really love your writing, but elegance? Maybe remember he's a murderer. Maybe. Thankfully, Treviño was not able to get away with the murder for that long. Just the next day, another worker on the ranch was suspicious of the grave, thank you, and called in the police. Now, 2 policemen then go to Treviño's office disguised as patients and are able to arrest him. Treviño tries to bribe them. He tries to do so with a pharmacy that his dad owns and the offer to buy each of these policemen a car, but they turn him down and arrest him. I'm not sure if that counts as more or less successful than Simmons' bribery attempt. Treviño was then convicted. It's what they categorized as a crime of passion, and he is in fact sentenced to death. There are some reports that he is the last person to ever be sentenced to death in Mexico, though at that time, apparently, no one was really being actually executed by the state, even if they were convicted and sentenced to death. All those sentences were then reduced to the next highest sentencing. So people weren't really expecting him to be executed anyway, from my understanding. Biography also reports that he was suspected of killing and dismembering several hitchhikers, though those accusations don't seem to have gone anywhere. Several of the different articles I read do have a suggestion that he's suspected of other crimes, but there's literally no other evidence presented anywhere. So we can't really say if he's killed multiple people or if Rangel was his only victim. Now, what's also interesting, and I think a large part of what intrigued Harris so much, was what happened to Treviño after he went to prison. He was able to offer medical services to other inmates and even was allowed to perform some minor surgeries, which makes me believe that he did in fact have access to a weapon in prison, unlike earlier reporting, but hopefully that was closely monitored and does not seem to have led to any violence. He became so good and helped so many inmates that he was eventually allowed out at night in order to treat people. And townsmen from outside of the prison also came to him for medical treatment. This is all reported by an unidentified source from the Mexican newspaper Reforma. He even had his own office in the prison, which I don't know about anybody else, but I'm getting major Michael Sheen from Prodigal Son vibes. As I said earlier, his sentence was eventually commuted to 20 years and he was released in 2000. He went on to continue practicing medicine. Some say in the poorest town in the area, and some say in the same place where he killed Rangel. So one of those is kind of nice and one of those is horrifying. You choose what you would like to believe. He did mostly treat senior citizens or the poor and didn't accept payment or only asked for a symbolic contribution. Before going to prison, he married a Dolores Montiel, who passed away while he was in jail. After his release, he remarried to a woman named Cristina, who also passed away, this time 5 years after Treviño's release. He had children and grandchildren as well, though unfortunately several of them did pass away young. One, I believe, from cancer and another from a car accident. But also, Treviño apparently knew that the Hannibal Lecter character was based off of him. I mean, he must have remembered Harris. And his family apparently made it into a joke. They used to call him Hannibal and Dr. Lecter. Because that's funny for some reason. That your relative is the inspiration for the most notorious cannibal killer of all time, but okay. Apparently Alfredo found it funny, so. Thomas Harris writes about his inspiration. My detective needed to talk to somebody with a peculiar understanding of the criminal mind. Lost in the tunnel of the work, I plodded along behind my detective when he went to the Baltimore State Hospital for the criminally insane to consult with an inmate. Who do you suppose was waiting in the cell? It was not Dr. Salazar. But because of Dr. Salazar, I could recognize his colleague and fellow practitioner, Hannibal Lecter.